this is Vikas Srivastava again, founder and CTO at AlmaBetter. Essentially, we'll be continuing with where we left off. So today we'll be learning about loops and iterations, as you can already infer from the title, right? So we'll be talking about important constructs which are called loops, right? So here we'll learn about for loop and while loop, and iterations are essentially you're iterating over some iterating in a loop, right? So essentially these two terms are more or less similar, but there are some differences. Okay. Okay, so loops are very important constructs in Python or in any other programming language. If you are already familiar with any other programming language, such as C or Java, might be in your college days, right? So what are the important, why are they important? So these constructs, they help you to execute a block of code repeatedly, right? So let's say if you want to perform a similar set of actions across, let's say, various elements in a sequence, then loops will help you ease your life a lot, right? So I think in your self project, the question which was given to you, right? So there you had to write a lot of statements repeatedly, right? So it was a lot cumbersome, but today we'll learn about loops, and that can help you do those tasks in a very easy way. Okay, so of course you'll often come face to face with situations where you will need to use a piece of code over and over again, but of course you don't want to write the same line of code multiple times, right? So it's a totally redundant task, and we want to have a lot of optimizations and from this perspective. So if there is some piece of code which performs a certain action on an element, and these elements are coming from an object such as, let's say, list or dictionary, so we can repeat those set of codes for all those elements, right? So we need to just write once, right? So we don't have to write it individually for all those elements. So everything will become clear today. Okay, so just bear with me. So there are two important types of loops in Python. So the first is for loop. So I'll just read this out. So in the context of most data science work, Python for loops are used to loop through an iterable object, right? So essentially looping means you are iterating over an object, what we call as an iterable object, right? So unless an object is not iterable, you cannot iterate it, right? So essentially iterating means you're jumping from element to element in a way. Okay, so that is what we mean by iteration, right? And then for each of those entries, if you want to perform the same action, so there will be using for loops. So for example, a for loop would allow us to iterate through a list, performing the same action on each item in the list, right? So essentially we'll jump over element element by element, right, in a proper sequence, and then we'll be able to perform the same action for all those elements, right? So the second type of loop which you'll encounter in Python is the while loop. So while loop is somewhat similar to an if statement, right? So it executes whatever the code or action you have provided within the while loop if the condition is true, right? So the only difference is that in because you're talking about a loop, the while loop will continue to execute the code within it as long as that condition is true, right? So we'll see examples of for loops and while loops for various data structures, and I think that will help you to augment your learning, right? So let's jump into for loops and see what we have in this, right? So as I've already told you, a for loop acts as an iterator in Python, right? So it goes through items that are in sequence or any other iterable item, right? So you know that a list has a notion of sequence, even a string has a notion of sequence. In fact, you can tell the same about a tuple, right? So tuple is essentially a sequence of element, but you have other data structures such as sets, you have dictionaries, right? So they don't have this notion of sequence, but they are nonetheless iterable, right? So iterable means we can jump over element and element in that particular data structure. So let's take an example of dictionary, right? So in dictionary, let's say you have 5 elements, and each elements are of course key value pairs. So you can jump over element by element, and you can perform a set of action, right? So that's what we mean by iterable item, right? So we can identify each object, or in fact each element in our data structure, whatever that is, and yeah, that will be called as an iterable, right? So all the elements of that iterable will be called as an iterable item, right? So iterable is an object which one can iterate over, right? So it's very straightforward definition. So essentially iterate is to just go over each of those elements in a proper fashion, in a proper sequence, right? So objects that we have learned about, we can iterate over, include strings, lists, tuples, and in fact you can do those for dictionaries too, right? So we'll see example of how to implement for loops and what kind of operations we can do for all these various data structures such as strings, lists, tuples, and dictionaries, right? So we'll have examples for all of these situations. So here's the general format for a for loop in Python, right? So if you're not familiar with for loop, so essentially what you need to do, so you can write for item in object, right? So imagine this object has a lot of items and we are going over item by item, right? So for item in object, and then you write some piece of code, right, with proper indentation. So whenever you when you provide the colon here, right? So let's just have a look at whatever things are there in the for loop statement, right? So we have the for keyword, then you have the item over which you are the item in the current iteration. Okay, so because object is, let's say, a list of items, so I can just try to give you a sense. So for example, let's say your item is essentially your sorry about this. Yeah, so let's say this is your entire object over which we want to iterate. Okay, so this is what our object is. Let's say this is your item 1, then you have item 2, right? And let's, for sake of simplicity, assume that there are only 5 items in this object, right? So for in the case of list, this item would be represented by a value and then the index. But in the case of dictionary, this item will be identified by a key value pair. Okay, so I hope you are already familiar and assimilated those concepts. Okay, so let's assume our object has these 5 items. So as you can see, so if you think about this line, so for statements to do stuff, so whatever action you want to perform, so in this case what will happen, so your object has 5 items, and then in the first iteration you will go to this particular item 1, then perform all whatever statement or action you want to perform in this item. Then what you will do, you will jump to the next item, perform the same set of action for that item. So same set of item, same set of action could be something like, let's say you have a list of strings, and for each element you want to convert them all to upper cases, right? So that could be one action. You want to capitalize your strings one by one. So here, let's say this is a list of strings. Okay, so our task is to perform the capitalization operation. So we'll go over each element, perform that same, and then what will happen? Eventually, we'll have a run out of the elements to perform that action, and then this for loop will end, right? Because we have now run out of the elements, right? So essentially, your for loop will run as many times as there are elements in your object. Okay, so in this case, we have 5 elements, so this for loop will execute 5 times. Okay, so this is the basic construct of for loop, and as you can see, we have the for keyword here, and then we have the item, as in the item 1, item 2, right? So we don't have to write item 1, item 2. It already makes sense of this, right? So of course, every item in succession. So we just need to write one particular thing to denote that particular variable, and then in keyword is really important. So for item in, and then your iterable object, right? So this could be a list or a dictionary or a tuple, right, or a string, and then you write colon, similar to what you learned in if, and then you write whatever action you want to perform. Okay, so this is the very basic for loop construct, which I think you should be able to remember. So we have the for keyword, then the item, which is essentially in each iteration that item value or the item element is being changed, right? Because we are jumping over element by element, right? And then so when we deal with examples, so this thing will become clear. But for now, I think you already know what's the overall structure of a for loop construct. Okay, so the variable name used for the item is completely up to the coder, right? So I can write here lm or element or whatever things we want to use at our own discretion, right? So we are totally free to do that. but the best idea is to you choose a variable name which makes more sense, right? So for example, let's say you are iterating over a list of countries. So ideally you should write for country in and then your list of countries, right? So your variable name, which is your, in this case, item, right? So choosing a name is up to you, right? So whatever makes the best sense according to you, you should use that variable name, right? So of course you can write for I in this, but I would suggest to follow the best practices. So whatever the list object is, whatever variables or whatever elements it contains, you name your item variable according to that. Okay, so for example, if you have a list of countries, you can write for country in, then your, let's say, country list. Okay, so let's work through several examples for loops. I will be going through examples on each of these specific data structures, and you'll get the idea how to implement for loop in a way. Okay, so let's take our first example. So let me first share this Padlet with you. I think this is the same thing as the last one, but nonetheless, I'll share with you it with everyone. So yeah, so my first question is, so here I have a variable what I'm calling as GOT houses, and then I have this weird looking object, right? So I want you to tell me what do we call this object GOT houses, right? So just look at this particular construct. Tell me what is this? Yeah. So can you? Yeah. So I so I want a complete picture. Of course, you can tell me. Yeah. So Rishabh is correct. So it's a list of strings. Okay, so this is what I wanted you to get to this. So of course, I am not expecting you to write the for loop as of now. I'm just asking you to tell me what is this, right? So this is a list of strings, right? Because each element is a string, and because all these elements are separated by comma, and then all these elements are enclosed in square brackets. So this is what we'll call as a list of strings. Okay, so it was really simple question, right? And yeah, I hope everyone knows this. So this is a list of strings, okay, because each element is a string and everything is closed in a square bracket. If you're forgotten or if you're not familiar, so all the elements in a list are separated by comma, right? So this is how we define a list, right? So all elements will be separated by comma and enclosed within square brackets. Okay, so here I have a list of strings which I'm calling as GOT houses, right? So if you are familiar with the popular TV series Game of Thrones, so you would be able to relate. But if you have not, I cannot do much about it. Then you'll just have to assume that it's just a list of strings. Okay, so I'll just give you an idea that in Game of Thrones there are various families, and they are also called as various houses, right? So it's like similar to gharanas in India, right? So you have different gharanas, right? So in the fiction Game of Thrones, we have several houses. So first is, let's say, Stark, then Arryn, then Baratheon, then we have Tully, then we have Greyjoy, Lannister, Tyrell, Martell, and then Targaryen. So all these Game of Thrones houses we have in this list of strings. Of course, there are a few more. I'm not included them here. Okay, so this is my list of string. Now what I need to do, I need to do a very simple task, right? So let's start with a very simple task. That what we need to do, we need to go over each element in our list of strings. So we'll go over each string in turn, and then we'll print something like house. So we'll append this prefix house and then print the name of that particular house, right? So let's try to do this. Okay, so how would we do that? Okay, so we write the for keyword, of course. Then we write the house. So in this particular general exam format, right? So it was named item, but because house is more relevant because we're talking about GOT houses here. So your variable name is house, which is relevant in this case. I don't think anyone would find it counterintuitive. And then you write the name of your variable, and then in, okay, and then you have your list of strings, right? Which is essentially the set of houses here, right? One thing is very important. So when I say that these are a bunch of words or a set of houses, right? So you don't have to take it literally, right? So it's not essentially a set of houses, but essentially this is a list, right? So whenever I think you should be able to infer when I am trying to say a generic term rather than a very specific Python lingo, right? So I think you should be able to differentiate between those. Okay, I'll try to be as precise as possible, but it would be really helpful if you can understand or infer what I'm trying to say, right? So I'll stick with the essential technical lingo. That's fine. So you have this list of strings, which is essentially the GOT houses. Then you write colon. Okay. So what we need to do. Uh, so if you just press enter here, okay, so it will automatically take you to the proper indentation. Okay. So here I can just, yeah. So if you press tab, so even if you are here, if you just press tab, so I press tab here, it automatically takes me to the proper indentation in this case. Okay, so you can use tab. Let's say if you miss some indentation or anything as such. Okay, so now here what I'm doing, because I already specified my task, I want to iterate over each of these houses and just print, add a prefix house and then write the name of that particular house, right? So it's a very simple thing. So I'm using a F string. So I hope you all are familiar. So within double quotes, I'm writing house and then space, and then within the curly braces, I'm specifying this variable house, right, which is coming from here. Okay, so what this will do, it will go over each element in your GOT houses. So for example, it will go to Stark, it will print house Stark. Okay, so let's run this in action. Oh, sorry. All right, so I need to define my list of strings, of course. So whenever a very useful thing, whenever you are getting any such error, name error, so you've already encountered various types of error previously, like syntax error, item type error, index error, things like those, right? So this is also another type of error, which is name error. So let's say if you try to execute a code in which your name has not been defined, right? So here I did not create any variable GOT houses and I try to execute this particular piece of code, right? So it throws an error because of the very obvious reason that this particular object has not been defined previously. That's why it's throwing the name error. So it's saying name GOT houses is not defined, right? So whenever in your code you are getting any such error, name error, that this is not defined, that means that variable is not available. So you might have missed to execute a particular piece of code. Okay, so this will really help you debug your errors. Okay, so if you're getting any such error, it means that, yeah, that variable is not available in the environment. It will only be available when I run or execute that particular piece of code. So now I have run this particular piece of code. So I have the GOT houses. Okay, so this is essentially the list of string. So I'll just run this for loop. Okay, so let's see each element by element and see what's happening. Okay, so first this loop, so this house, it goes to this element Stark. Okay, so in the first iteration, house contains the value Stark within string, within quotes, right? So essentially it's a string. So in the first iteration, house takes the value Stark, and then here it passes it, and then it can print house Stark. Okay, now what we can do in the second iteration, so once this element, whatever the performance, which whatever the task it was assigned, it has done that. So it moves to the second element, which is array. So in this case, in the second iteration, house will take the value array. Now it performs the same set of tasks, because I've already told you, right? So when do we use for loops? So suppose if you want to execute the same piece of code for all the elements in sequence, right? So this is where we'll be mostly using for loops. So it goes to array. Okay, it prints house, and then the value of house here is array. Okay, so it prints this particular thing. Now it goes to the third element, Bharathian. It does the same task and then prints house Bharathian, because in the third iteration, house will take the value Bharathian, right? So it will go over each element in turn and then print everything. So after house Targaryen, it does not print anything, because for loop is constrained by the size of the iterable object. So in this case, our iterable object is GOT houses, which is our list of strings. So this for loop will get executed only that many times as there are a number of elements in our iterable object. So in this case, we had, I'm not sure, so these are 4. and then we have 5. So there are 9 elements in this case, right? So it will only execute this print statement 9 times. Okay, so this is the very basic for loop construct. Okay, uh, so let's say if I want to, I just want to get an idea from you. Let's say if I want to print house, everything in reverse order. Let's say house Targaryen first, then house Martell, then house Tyrell, house Lannister, house Greyjoy, and the last would be house Stark. So can you tell me, just change this code a bit. So what things you need to change here so that you can get the corresponding output. So wait a bit, I'll just clear the this thing, blackboard. Okay, and then you can start answering. Okay, just hang on. Okay, so please post your answers here now. Okay, so what do we need to do? So I'm just expecting a very minor change from you guys in this whole piece of code. So let's say I just want to start printing from house Targaryen, so in the reverse direction. So house Targaryen, house Martell, house Tyrell, house Lannister, house Greyjoy, house Tully, house Baratheon, house Arryn, and then house Stark. So in this fashion I want to get these printed. So what do you think we should do? Okay, so I'm getting some really good answers. Okay, so let's assume the print statement, of course it will be the same thing, so there will be no change in there. Okay, so a lot of people are writing. So Prashant and Rohan, they're writing. So for H in GOT houses, and then colon colon -1. So when you write colon colon -1, it essentially reverses your list in this case, right? Okay, so we can let's see if that works. Okay, so let me just print this. Okay, so now as you can see, we are able to print the houses in reverse order, right? So what is the change which we need to do? We just needed to add this particular piece of thing in front of GOT houses. So earlier we did not need to write anything, but if you want them to iterate in the reverse order, so we can write colon colon -1 in this case. Okay, so Saeed, can you please answer in the Padlet? So I've shared the Padlet link. So please put your answer in the Padlet. Okay. So yeah, so this was a really simple task, and we were able to do this. So that's great, guys. So you're able to understand what's going on. So I'll just clear this Padlet, and then maybe I'll use this. I'll come back to this when I ask you the next question. Okay, great. So, so there's another interesting way in which we can loop through the elements of a list, right? And here what we'll be using, so we'll be using the enumerate function. Okay, so there's a enumerate function which is inbuilt in Python, so you don't have to write this function, right? So it's available in Python. So this is another way to loop through the elements of a list. And using enumerate requires us 2 iterators, which is index and row, right? So in our case, we had a single iterator, which we were calling as house, right? So this iterator was taking different values depending upon the iteration. So in the case of enumerate, we'll have 2 iterators. So firstly, not only the index, the second will be, so I'll just correct this, so it will be the element. Okay, so the element of the list. Okay, so let's take an example of that. So here I'll also add a comment for you guys. So using enumerate function to loop through the elements of a list. Okay, so here what we need to do, so we'll of course write the for keyword. Okay, but instead of single variable here, single iterator, we'll have 2 iterators. One is number, and then we'll write comma, and then we have the second iterator. So the first iterator, when okay, let me just tell you the entire for statement, and then we'll dive deep into this, right? So I'm writing 2 iterators here, separated by comma, and the same keyword in, and then I'm writing this enumerate function. So enumerate keyword, right, or enumerate function, and then within the parenthesis you provide the list. So in this case, we have the list of strings, which I'm calling as GOT houses. Okay. So now, of course, you need to provide the colon, and then with the proper indentation, you need to print number comma house. So you're printing number comma house, or we can print it in whatever way we want to. Okay. So that's fine. So okay, so the first thing here, it requires us two iterators whenever we're using enumerate. So it requires us two iterators. The first iterator is your index. So this number will always correspond to the index of the element, which is in the current iteration. And then the second iterator, which is in this case house, is the element itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and print this, and we'll be able to demystify what's happening. So in the first iteration, number is essentially the index. So what is the index of the first element? So this is 0. Okay, because you know the indexing starts from 0 in Python. Okay. So Shubham is asking a question. So how does Python recognize by writing number, as it is not a inbuilt function? So as I told you, whatever the iterators you will have in front of the for keyword, so whatever the iterators you will have in front of the for keyword, so these are essentially variable names. Okay, because in this case, what's happening, that the value contained in your number variable is changing with each and every iteration, right? I hope that makes sense. So can we put number +1 in for loop? So okay, so Rohan is asking, it is always index an element, or can we have other variable see, what information do you have for an element in a list? First think about that. So what sort of information you have for for an element in a list? The max you know it is the index of the element and the value it contains, right? So here when we use the enumerate, so see, when we are not using the two iterators, when we just had a single iterator, right? So in this case for house and GOT houses. Okay, so in this case, the at each iteration, this house variable will take whatever the value here, right? So it will consider the value of that element, okay, by default. Okay, if we just have one. But when we're using the enumerate function, so here each element is denoted by the index of that element, which denotes essentially the position or the location of that element in a list, and then that element has a value associated with it, right? So in this case, when we're using the enumerate function, so we have two sets of information about a particular element which we are iterating over, right? So the first is your index, and the second is the value that element contains. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. So here, that's why we are seeing 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So because the indexing starts from 0, so the first element has index 0, and the value of that element is star, right? So I can also show you here. So GOT houses. So the first element is star, right? But the index for this element is 0, right? So this is what I'm getting when I'm printing number. Now let's move to the second element, which is arrayn, right? So now we are in the second iteration. So now number variable contains the value 1, which is the index of the second element, and then the value which this element contains. So what is the value? So that will be stored in house. So here I am printing house, right? So it takes the value arrayn in the second iteration. So similarly, it goes to the next, it moves to the third element, which is Bharathian. So what is the index of this particular element? So index is 2, and what is the value contained in this element? So this is Bharathian, right? So the index for each iteration is stored in the number, and the element and the value of the element is stored in the variable house. Does that make sense? Right? So it makes sense. Can you guys tell me over chat if this makes sense and you are able to understand what's happening? So what's the difference between using a for loop without enumerate and using enumerate, right? So in enumerate, we'll have access to both of the information, not only the index but also the value that element contains, right? So this is really important. So you need to understand. So whenever you are writing for loops in this way, so you need to understand what is the element of your data structure, in this case your god houses, right? So okay, so let's see what this gives us, essentially enumerate, right? So I try to, yeah, give you an idea. Oh my god, what's happening? Okay, okay, so let's try to see what this gives us, right? So it gives me something like this is what we call an iterator object, right? But uh, let's convert this to list, and then we'll should be able to get what it is, right? So essentially when I am writing enumerate got houses and of course converting that to list, so it is generating a list of tuples. Okay, but in our for loop we didn't even need to write list here, right? So we didn't even need to write a list here, because just keep this in mind, you don't have to worry about this, because these things will become clear in this week. But when I'm just writing, when you're just writing enumerate god houses, so it generates an iterator object. So when you just write enumerate god houses, so it's an iterator object, which is essentially, it has the information about what is number and what is house. Okay, so let's try to see what this particular iterator object contains, which is enumerate god houses. So hang on for a second. Okay, so now this generates a list of tuples. So each tuple has two elements, right? Each tuple has two elements. The first element of each tuple corresponds to the index, which is essentially number, and the second corresponds to house, right? And I think you already might have guessed by now. So whenever we write something like number comma house, right? So just try to give an example. So let's say if you have x is equal to something like 1 comma 2. Okay, so what this is x, so I can print x here, right? So x is nothing but a tuple only, right? So if you don't specify the brackets here, so essentially this is the same thing. So you're writing number comma house, so number will have some value, house will also have some value, right? So when you're using the enumerate function, we are essentially saying that iterate over the list of tuples, and each of those tuple has two elements. The first element of each tuple is the index of the element which we are iterating through, and the second element of each tuple is essentially the value of that element in your list. Does that make sense? So does this make sense? Can you please let me know if you are able to understand how enumerate works, right? So when we're using enumerate function in the for loop, so essentially we have an iterator object which is nothing but a list of tuples. Okay, where each tuple has two elements, or right, each element has two, each tuple element has two elements. The first is corresponding to your index, and the second is corresponding to your element value, or the value of the element, essentially, right? So so in this case you need to understand why are we getting a list of tuples when I am trying to print this, right? So I hope you understand that, because here we are writing for number comma house. So whenever you have anything similar to this, something comma this, so let's say two values, a comma 1, right? So that will be a tuple only. You need to understand this. Okay, okay, so this makes sense. So of course you can use the f string. So basically I'll try to make this a lot interesting. So let's say the house number, so the house number of house, okay, okay, it might be redundant. So the house number of house, now I need to specify the house, right? So I'll print house here, and then I can write the number, house number of house, this is of course the so what should I write? So let's say I don't want to start from 0, I want to start from 1. So I can write number plus 1. So for each value of number, it will add 1 and then print. Okay, so let's keep it. Okay, so I've already changed it, so I can run it here only. Okay, so I hope, yeah. So see, as you can see, the house number of house Stark is 1, because in the first iteration number is taking a value 0, because that is the index of the first element. But here we are adding 1 to this number, right? So here we are adding 1, so that's why instead of 0 we are getting 1 here. For the second element, um, it prints the house, so the house number of house Aaron is, and then in the second iteration number is taking the value 1, because that is what the index of the second element in Python. And then I can add 1, so it adds 1 and then prints 2 here. Okay, so can you guys tell me if you are able to understand whatever I have taught till now? So the how to iterate in a for loop using enumerate and without enumerate, right? So there should probably be no confusion, if at all. Okay, that's great. So Priyanshi is asking, so is the list of tuples by default? So that's the construct of the enumerate function only, right? So the enumerate function yields an iterator object. Okay, we'll talk about iterator objects and generator objects later on in the course, but for now you just need to understand that using the enumerate function, it yields an iterator object, and if we just apply the list function on that iterator object, it gives us a list of tuples. Essentially, we didn't even have to write a list here, right? We didn't even have to write list here, right? So it understands automatically in the iterations that each element in each iteration is a tuple only, right? So what is that tuple? So tuple is essentially your index comma the value of that element. Okay, so does that answer your question, Priyanshi? Yeah, can you please let me, yeah, that's great to know. So let's move forward. Okay, let's move forward. So okay, now we have been iterating over a list of strings. Now let's do some more interesting tasks, but in this case I have a list of numbers. Okay, so first let's talk about the task which we need to do. So suppose you are given a list of numbers. Okay, so similar to what we have here, which I'm in fact calling as list of numbers. You need to find the corresponding squares of these numbers and zip them together in a dictionary. So what does this mean? That you need to find the corresponding squares of these numbers, store them in a list maybe, and then you can zip those lists together such that you come up with a dictionary. So each element of this dictionary will have a key corresponding to our original number, and the value will be the square of that number. Okay, that makes sense. So essentially our final task is to come up with a dictionary where we'll have the, let's say, num. So let's say this is one element, so this key will be the number and the value will be nothing else than num squared. Okay, so the key will be number and the corresponding value for that key will be the square of that number. Okay, so this is what we want to do. So firstly, we need to create a list of the corresponding squares of these numbers. So how do we go about this? Okay, okay, so yeah, just hold on your curiosity for now, guys. So let me just ask you and then you can answer. Okay, so okay, so someone is asking what is the use of enumerate. So this is what I have been talking for the last 10 minutes. So the use of the enumerate is to help us iterate over each element, where we can not only access the value of the element but also the index. Does that make it clear, Jay? Okay, so all right. So so before we do this problem, okay, so we finally come up with a dictionary. So let's try to just do some perform some basic action before we finally get the dictionary. Okay, so here is the list of numbers. So this list has numbers such as 1, 2, 4, 6, 11, 14, 17, 20. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and execute this cell. Telling you again, so if you want to execute a cell, you need to just press shift plus enter, and then of course you have a bunch of different functionalities, so you can move this cell up, down, add a comment, right? So that's why Google Colab is really helpful. Okay, So okay, so now we have this list. Okay, so now I'll write a for loop to just print the square of the numbers. Okay, so I'm not creating another list. Of course I'll do that later on, but I just for now I just want to iterate over my list of numbers, print their corresponding squares. Okay, so what do I write? I write the usual for keyword, then I write the variable or the iterator variable name. So in this case, because I have a list of numbers, so it makes sense that I write it as number. Okay, so this is more intuitive. Then of course you have the in keyword, and then your iterable object, in which in this case this is your list of numbers. Okay, so now when you are here, so if you just press enter, you will be taken to the appropriate indentation, right? So essentially whatever is within a proper indentation in for loop, only those things will be executed when you try to run this for loop. Okay, so maybe I'll just show you that example, but for now let's concentrate on this. Okay, so I've created a variable squared number. So this variable was not anywhere earlier, but I'm assigning this variable the value, which is nothing but the square of this number, right? So square of this number. Okay, so let's say if you're talking about the first iteration, what this will do. So the number has the value 1 here, because here we are not using enumerate, so we don't need to use the two iterators here. We can just make work with only one iterator, right? So this will essentially contain the value of the element which we are iterating through. So in squared number, I'm storing the square of this particular number, and then I'm using the f string to print. So the square of number, so this number is coming from here, and then is the squared number is coming from here. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so when the for loop starts executing, it goes to the first element, it calculates the squared number that is equal to 1 squared. Okay, and then it prints the square of number, which is 1. So square of 1 is, and then the squared number. So what is the squared number here? So is essentially 1 squared, which is 1. So it will print this statement, square of 1 is 1. Now it moves to the second element. So here now number is equal to 2. So squared number will have the value 2, and the squared number will have the value 2 squared, that is 4. So it will print the square of 2 is 4. Okay, so this is what we are getting in the second line. So similarly, it will iterate over all the elements in our list of numbers and print the corresponding task, right? So as you can see, we wanted to do this specific set of action for each element, but we didn't have to write it this separately for each element, right? So that's why using for loop construct is really helpful, right? So we can perform a set of similar actions for all the elements in our iterable object. In this case, that iterable object is your list of numbers. Okay. So someone is asking, can we print without f and print? Yes, there are different ways, which has been already discussed earlier. So you might want to revisit those things. So even without using the f string, we can print, right? So but f string, these are the latest practices, and I think you should definitely use the f string whenever you are printing something here and there, right? So so here you don't have to specify whether it's a string or a number, right? So you don't have to do all those drama, right? So you can simply provide whatever you want to print within a curly brace, and it will work like magic, right? So I hope you understand this particular list of numbers. Now, what was our task? So let's go back. So we need to find the corresponding squares of these numbers in a list, right? So what do we do? Okay, so let's look at this particular thing, right? So here earlier what we did, we just printed these squared numbers for each iteration, but we didn't store them in a particular data structure or a list eventually, right? So here let's do that particular task. So I've created an empty list here, which I'm calling as squared numbers, and this list is essentially empty now, right? So it does not have any element. So this list is empty, and this is my variable squared numbers. Now what I'll do, I'll write the same line which I've written above. So for number in list of numbers, I'll create a variable which I'm calling as square, and then storing the square of that number in that variable for that iteration, right? And then what we will do, so I think you might remember from your list methods, right? So you have the append method which helps you append any element to a list, right? So in this case, we have this squared number which is an empty list at this moment, right? So we have not yet executed this. So what will happen in this case? So let's go ahead and just execute this particular piece of code. Okay. So in this case, let's zoom in and see what's happening. Okay, so I'll just print the list of numbers so that you can see. So list of numbers, it automatically suggests me, right? So these are easy hacks which you can employ to save some time, right? So now what I'm doing, so let's look at the first iteration. So what's happening in the first iteration? So the number takes the value 1, a square will be assigned the value 1 squared, that is 1 again, and then we have the squared numbers empty list. So we are now calling the append method, and in the append method I'm providing the element which I want to add to the list. So in this case, in the first iteration, the squared numbers is essentially an empty list, but we're adding one element, right? So what is the element which we're adding? So the square which we have calculated from here. Okay, so in the append method, in the parentheses, we'll provide this particular variable, right, which we have already calculated. And then right, so now it moves to the second element, so now it goes to 2. Okay, so the number contains the value 2. Now the square will be 2 squared, that is 4. So squared numbers is now 1, but now it will add the element 4, right, because square contains the value. So what I can do, I can print squared numbers here. Okay, I can print squared numbers here, and as you can see, okay, so let's, okay, so in fact I had written that, I just needed to uncomment it, but anyway, okay, so let's see what's happening, right? So because I'm printing the squared numbers after I have appended the element, so in the first iteration, it will return me a list with one element, which is 1, right, because its value square at that in the first iteration is 1. Now if I move to the second element, right, in my list, so now we are at 2, square is now 4, and that will be added to your squared numbers, right? So now 4 will be added to this list because we're using the append method, right? So now this is a list with 2 elements, right? So we'll do this for all the elements in sequence. So the third element, it will store the square of this, so 4 squared. So essentially it will give us 1 comma 4 comma 16, right? Because we're appending the list object, so those elements are getting appended to this particular list which we had defined earlier, right? So you can infer that list objects are mutable in this case, right? Because they're meant to be they're meant to work in that way only, right? So with each iteration we are able to add one element to our list, right? And that's the same list which we are printing. Okay, so let's uncomment this, and then this comment that, and uncomment this particular piece of line. Okay, so let's execute this. So now as you can see, the list of squared numbers is 1 comma 4 comma 16 comma 36 121. So we have the squares of the corresponding elements. Okay, Sanchita is saying every iteration the squared numbers will become empty. I didn't get your question. Can you be a little discreet? Okay, so Sumanta is asking what happens. Okay, sorry. Okay, all right. So let's address the question asked by Sumanta only. So he's asking, if you create the empty list inside the loop, then what will happen, right? So it's very easy to determine. So you don't even need to ask anyone. You can just cut this piece of code and add it here. Okay. So now I want you to tell me, right, what will happen in this case. Okay, so let's just run this. what will happen? My list only has one element. Instead, I expected it to have the squares of as many these elements, right? Okay. So why is this happening? Okay. So let me tell you. So let's look at the first iteration. Okay. So in the first iteration, number contains the value 1. So squared numbers is essentially here an empty list which I have created. Okay. So now square will contain the value 1 squared, that is 1, and then I'll append that to squared numbers. And now the squared numbers, so if I try to print this, okay, so maybe I'll just uncomment that to save a lot of effort. Okay, so I'll just comment this. Okay, now you can see what's going wrong here, right? So you are, so with each iteration, okay, you are reinitializing your squared numbers, right? So in each iteration, it's not appending the elements, but it's just only storing that element there. Okay, so we need to put this outside. Okay, so we need to put this outside, then only this will make sense. Does that answer your question, Sumanta? Yeah, Sumanta, can you please reply if you have understood this particular thing? Okay, that's great. All right. So I hope, yeah, you guys understand. Yeah, this makes sense or not? Okay. Now, now we have got the list of squared numbers, right? So what was the task again? So So let's look at this task. So we needed to find the corresponding squares of these numbers and zip them together in a dictionary. Okay, so now we have two lists of equal length because in the other list we just have the squares of those numbers, but the total number of elements in those two lists will be the same. Okay, so what we need to do now, okay, so now we have the list of squared numbers. So I'll create a variable which I'm calling as zip dict. Okay, in fact, this is yeah, zip dict, or I can only simply say dict, whatever you want to. So here, firstly, what we'll do, we'll call the zip function, and in the arguments, we'll have the two lists which we want to append. So the first is, of course, your original list of numbers, and the second argument is the new list which we have come up with, which we are calling as squared numbers. So we'll zip each element by indexes, right? So and then I'm calling the dict function here, right? So you are already familiar with this from the previous week, right? So how these uh, functionalities work, right? So you are already familiar with the dict function, right? So now we can print the zip dict. So let's see what it prints. Okay, so okay, let me also print the list of numbers here, so you'll be able to understand what's going on here. List of numbers. Okay, so I'll just print this. Okay, I'll print the squared numbers too. Okay, squared numbers. Okay, so now as you can see, when we are zipping them together using the zip function and then calling dict on top of that, so what's happening? The first element, so this becomes our key for the first element, and then this one becomes the value for that particular key corresponding to that key, right? So now this is one element of our zip dict. Now let's talk about the second element. So the key for the second element is 2 and the value for the second element is 4. Okay, so this is our second element in the dictionary. Okay, and so on and so forth. So the number of elements in our dictionary and the number of elements in each of these two lists, they are essentially the same. Okay, all right. So now let's move forward. Let's include some more things which we can play around with. Okay, so for now, can you please tell me if you're able to understand up till this point of time? Yeah, so yeah, just please drop a simple yes if you're able to understand up till now. But if you have any such confusion, you can definitely ask them and I'll try to, yeah, clarify them. Okay, yeah, just give me a second, I'll add some more. Okay, So now let's try to add some different uh, set of tasks which we can do using a for loop, right? So now suppose our task is we don't want to print the square of all the numbers. We only want to print the squares of those numbers which are even. Okay, so let's see how we can do this. So you have learned about the if statement. So let's see how we can include the if statement, else statement inside the for loop. Okay. Uh, okay, so let's see. So we have this original list of numbers from above, right? So it has these elements 1, 2, 4, 6, 11, 14, 17, 20. Now I only want to print the squares of those numbers which are even. Okay, so understand this. Okay, so now you start with the usual for keyword. I'll write the iterator variable name. So in this case, because we're dealing with list of numbers, so again I'm using the number variable name. Okay, in you'll of course use, and then of course your iterable object, which is in this case your list of numbers, and then the colon. Okay, so always follow whatever I've discussed when you're trying to write a for statement. So for iterator name, in keyword, and then your iterable object, and then colon. So this is what completes your for statement. And of course if you're using enumerate anything as such, so we'll have two iterators there, right? So now so I've written this for statement. Okay, now inside this what I'm doing an additional check. So I'm writing an if statement. So if, right, of course, as you can see, we have a proper indentation here. That means the if statement is within the scope of the for loop. Okay, so that condition will always get checked during each iteration. This is what I mean. Okay, so I'll write a if statement if this number mod 2, as in if this number is divisible by 2, as in it yields no remainder. So we'll use the modulo operation to find if a number is divisible by 2, right, and equate this to, so I 2 equals to 0, right? So in the if statement, so this will return a boolean value, so either true or either false. So if this is true, then if that is true, so now we come to the indentation within the if statement, right? So as you can see, there is one, this is of course one indentation here, but now within if you have one indentation extra. Okay, so that means it's not only in the for statement but within the if statement as well. Okay, so I hope you understand that particular concept. So now if this number is divisible by 2, we'll square this number and store this in a variable I'm calling as squared number, right? So the value it contains is number squared, and the name of the variable is squared number, and I'll print the square of number is squared number. Okay, so this is in the if part. But what about the else part? So of course you can choose not to write the else part, but if let's say if you want to handle or let's say if you want to print anything as such in the else part, so you can do that. So you remember from the last class that in the else part you don't need to even provide any boolean, right? So whatever thing that is not within the scope of the if statement or any such condition which is violated here, that will go to the else block. Okay, so in the else block we don't even need to specify any such condition, right? So you just write else colon, and then you can print whatever you want to. So here I have printed something like I am an odd number, my master prohibits me from printing the squares of odd numbers. It's strange, but okay, right? So this is what I'm printing. Okay, so there are two bunch of print statements here. I'll just comment them for now, but their importance will become really clear now. Okay, so just hang on. So let's go ahead and execute this particular piece of statement. Okay, so now let's look at the first element. So this number is not divisible by 2, right? 1 is not divisible by 2, so it does not execute whatever there is in the if statement, but it executes whatever there is in the else part. So it will print I am an odd number 1, right? Because here number has also been passed, and then it's right, it's printing my master prohibits from printing the squares of odd numbers, something like that. Now you move to the second element in your iteration, or in the second iteration you have 2. 2 is divisible by 2, for which I'm very lucky now, right? So 2 is divisible by 2. So in this case, yeah, this part is true. So that means this will get executed. Okay. So it will calculate the square of that number. So essentially 2 squared, and then print square of that number. Okay. So it prints the square of 2 is 4. Now move to the third element, which is 4. So 4 is divisible by 2. Then again, yeah, it does whatever the operation that is defined within the if part, right? Because the if condition is fulfilled here. Similarly, you go to the element 6, that is again divisible by 2. If part is executed for that. Now you move to 11, that is not divisible by 2. It will execute the else part. Okay, so as you can see, I'm in odd number 11. My master prohibits something like this. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. Okay, now can you just guys do a little change from here? So maybe I'll just copy paste this code. Okay, so let's not have the else part. I just want you guys to tell me. So wait a bit, I'll just clear this. Sorry. Okay, so of course I'll try to add my indentation here. Okay, I am not able to for some reason. Okay, so but assume that yeah, this is in proper indentation. So now the question is, if you want to print all those numbers which are odd. Okay, so how do you do that? So now your task is to print all those numbers which are odd but and not even. Okay, so what change will you do? Right, so it's a very easy question, right? So you can just copy paste whatever I have written and just make the tiny change which you need to do, right? So I can see that Sriram is writing not if number mod 2 not equal to 0. Okay, so it's essentially a very simple task which you need to do, right? So here instead of equals to, you just need to write not equal to. That's it, right? So it will print uh, the square of all the odd numbers. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Okay, okay, great. So let's move forward. Okay, now there is another very important function which I think you'll find really useful. I think but I cannot emphasize this enough. This function you will be encountering a million times throughout the program. Okay, so there is a range function. Okay, let me see if I did not skip anything. Okay, so range function is a pretty useful function to get a sequence of numbers. So it takes 3 arguments: start, stop, and the step. Okay, so let's start with a very basic. Okay, okay, again I'll not write okay, so what is my range? So this is my starting point, this is my ending point, and this is the step size I want to take, right? So what do you think this will print? Maybe I can just yeah clear this and let you guys answer this. 359. Okay, so can you guys answer what will happen if I just execute this particular statement? Okay, so I can yeah, in fact yeah, so what will happen? So I'm just asking what will I get in the output? Okay, so a lot of people are saying that they will get these numbers. Okay, so some are saying 10 will not be there, 9 will be there. Some are saying it will start from 1, it will not start from 0. Okay, so a bunch of variants here. Okay, Rooney is saying uh, 0 to 9. Stanta is saying list from 0 to 10. Okay, Rohit Thawali is saying 1 comma. Okay, still to write. Okay, so Ankit Kumar is saying. Okay, so let's demystify this. Let's see what happens when I try to execute this. Right, so it just says me range 0 to 10. Okay, so this is again an example of. So if I try to get the type of this, okay, let me see if it works. So this is of range type. Okay, so that's fine. So if I write list here, okay, so if I write list here, So what this will give me? This will give me the list of numbers starting from 0 to 9. Okay, so this will not be included. Okay, so 0 to 9, what will happen? Okay, so now you know that, yeah, this will print me a bunch of these numbers. So let's say if I increase the step size to 3. Okay, so now can you tell me? I'll just clear the notebook, blackboard here, and then you guys can tell me what will be the output for this particular thing. Okay, so can you tell me? So now, because I'm applying the list function on top of the range, so it will give me a list of numbers, of course. Okay, so similar to what enumerate gives us, range is also an iterator. Okay, okay, but in this case it is just a simple list, not a list of tuples, and because it has access to just the value of the element. Okay, so 0369. Okay, wonderful. Let's see if that works. Okay, what about 2? So I can also, yeah, try to run this. So step size will be 2. So 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Yeah, so it does not go to 10 because 10 will not included. Okay, right? So let's say if you were asked to print the, okay, so I can clear this and I can ask you guys. Okay, so write a code to print the square of first 20 or first 10 even numbers, even natural numbers, in fact. So can you guys, yeah, try to tell me? So write a code to print the square of first 10 even natural numbers, right? So you need to use range. And one important thing, here we in fact don't even need to use the list uh, thing. Okay, so let's try to see if this works, right? So now, yeah, you need to tell me, you need to print the square of first 10 even natural numbers. Okay, so what is it you are doing? So okay, so uh, I want answers from everyone. Okay, so if I'm not seeing that you're not interacting or participating in the discussion, you'll not be getting any credit for today's class, right? So you'll essentially be getting 0. So you need to participate, right? This is how you'll learn, right? So you can see, so Priyanshi is saying, so I lost Priyanshi here. Okay, so here's she. So maybe I can, okay. So I'll try to sort this in an alphabetical way, maybe. Okay, let me see if there is such an option to supposing. Okay, all right. Yeah, I don't think we have that luxury here. But let's see what are the answers people are writing. So Priyanshi is writing for I in range 0, comma 11. So if I percentage 2. Okay, so let's uh, take her code and see if that works or not. Okay, so I'll just take. Uh, in fact, yeah, she wrote something in the title too. Okay, so I'll just take this. Okay. Okay. So write something like this. So if, okay, so I'll just change the indentation a bit. Okay, so how do you do this? So go to here after colon, you just press enter, and yeah. So she's saying that this should work. Okay, so let's see. It prints the first 10 natural numbers. First 10 even natural numbers, right? That my question was. But it's only printing the first 6. Okay. So is there any change you would want to do? It will be J. Okay. So this will be J. Okay. So it's still printing the first 6. So any change do you think you need to do? Maybe yeah, you can edit it here. Let's see. So Sish is writing something a bit different. So instead of 11, he has written 21. In fact, yeah, 21, and the step size he has defined as 2. Okay. Okay. So let's see if we can. Okay. So maybe we start from 2 till let's say 23, maybe. Yeah. Um, let's 1 second. 21 and then step size of 2. Okay. So let's try to execute this. Okay. Let's see what we get. So we get 4, 5, and then we get all the 10, right? So this looks fine. So you can use a range function in this case, right? In fact, you can do a lot more other things, right? So you can even have in range, you can have 0 to 11 or 10, and then maybe just try to manipulate I a bit. So here you can have something like I plus 2, something like that. Okay. But this is what will help us get the first 10 even natural numbers. Okay. So does that make sense, everyone? Okay, so we don't need if block. Of course, I need block, right? Uh, because what I need to do, I need to print the first 10 even natural numbers. So I need to do a check if a number is, of course, okay, okay. So I, okay, no. So I can simply print I, right? Okay, yeah, makes sense. So I can simply print I, right? Because this is what I've already encoded in the range. Okay. Yeah, thanks for correcting. Yeah. Okay, so but here, of course, you can have it, let's say from 0 to 10, and then maybe you can add some if condition here, play around with I plus 2 or something like this, right? And yeah, this should work like magic. Okay, so here I'll just put it to 21, then yeah, right? So it prints me the first 10 natural number, even natural numbers. Okay, yeah, so that's great. Okay, so now I need you guys to do some more work. Okay, so I'll just yeah. Okay, so now our task is we need to find the sum of, let's say, first 10 natural numbers, sum of first 10 natural numbers. Okay, so can you please write the code for that? So we want to find the sum of first 10 natural numbers. I'm not putting any condition for let's say even or odd. So I'm just asking you to print the sum, okay, of the first 10 natural numbers. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so some people, so for I in range 0, comma 10, comma 1. Okay, that's great. I didn't tell you the default step. So maybe if, let's say in the range, if I don't specify, does it work? Right, so the default step size is 1. Okay, so maybe you can try to optimize that. Okay, so let's say when you have a step size of 1, you don't even need to specify that because that is the default step size in range. Okay, let's see at some brilliant answers. Okay, so Priyanshi is writing for I in range this sum is equal to sum plus I. Aniket is writing, so for I in range this a is equal to a plus I, print a. Okay. Okay. Shweta is still writing. Okay. Rajat Pal has written, so count is equal to 0 for I in range 11. Okay, in fact, that's great. That'll start from 0. Where is I lost Rajat? Yeah. Okay, so count is plus is equal to I and then print I. Okay, so I can take. Okay, so I can see some answers from you guys. Okay. So even let's say if I do not specify 0, what would I get? Right, so I get the same thing, right? So in the range, if you just specify one value. So here in this case I provided 10, so it will print me uh, all the numbers which start from 0 uh, till 9, and then of course with the step size 1. Okay, so this is what Rajat used. Okay, so that's great. Okay, right. So now if I, let's say if I want to add the get this sum of the squares of a number in a given list. Okay, so in that case your list was your first 10 natural numbers, but it could be any such list, right? So here we have the list of numbers from above. Okay, so let's say the sum of squares will be 0. Okay, and then it will print, yeah. So the sum of squares of our list of numbers is 1063. Okay, so in our case, let's say if we had a range uh, so first, I told you first 10 natural numbers, right? So we'll not include 0. So we'll have till 11. Okay. So let's see if this works. So it should give me 55. Sorry. Uh, okay, so it's not square, simply the number. Okay. Okay, so it's 55. Uh, Sheets, can you please unmute mute yourself? Yeah, that's great. Okay, so in this case you want to add a number in iteration, right? So here what's happening, right? So the first number is 1. Okay, so sum of squares is initially 0, so sum of squares, so this is another way of writing this, right? So you already know, so sum of squares is initially 0, so the new sum of squares will be assigned a value which is defined by here. So 0 plus your number, that is 1. So now in the first iteration sum squares contains a value 1. Okay, now let's move to the next iteration. So range, the number will take the value 2. Sum of squares now contains the value 1. Okay, because it has been updated, of course. So 1 plus your 2, so that's 3. And now sum of squares will have the value 3. Okay, so you can always when in doubt, always try to print your variables in the loop. Okay, so that will help you debug your code or make sense of what's happening. Okay, so as you can see, so in the first iteration the sum squares is 1, then 3, then 6, then 10, 15, 21, 28, 36, 45, 55. Okay, now one important thing is this print statement is outside the for loop, right? So whatever we have written within the for block, so it does not matter to that, right? So this will get executed nonetheless. Okay, but of course this will get executed once the for loop has stopped iterating. Okay, once it has gone through all the elements. Okay, that makes sense. So okay, so now let's take another example. Okay, so up till now we have only implemented for loops for list objects. From the last week, you know that there are other objects in Python which are sequence of elements such as strings, tuples. Let us try and apply for loop to iterate over their elements. Okay, so let's take a particular string. Okay, so now we are trying to iterate over a string. So this is a sample string which I have stored here. So this is I'm calling as Heisenberg code. So if some people are familiar from the popular drama which is Breaking Bad, so you would be able to relate. So this is the string which I've stored here. So I am the one who knocks. Okay, and it also has exclamation mark. Okay, so this is my string variable. Now what I can do, I can use the enumerate function, because using enumerate, what we can have, we can not only access the index, not only the value but also the index. Okay, so I'll write something like for index comma char in enumerate, and then I'll pass my string here. Okay, so let's try to run this. So I'll just need to execute this cell. So the index is 0 and the character is I, right? Makes sense. I is the first character, the index is 1 and the character is space, right? Second character is space. The index is 2, which is the third element, and the character is A, right? So I hope, yeah, this makes sense, right? So in this way we can iterate over the over a string, right? Or maybe let's say if you don't want index, so I can just copy this piece of code. Okay, so I'll just add it here. So I don't want to deal with index, so I don't even need enumerate in this case. Okay, I don't even need that. Okay, so so maybe I can simply write the character is, okay, a cat. Okay, so let's go ahead and execute this, right? So the character is I, the character is this, the character is A, right? Uh, so we are iterating over each character in our string, okay, which is essentially similar to in the elements in your list, okay. So I hope that makes sense, okay. So yeah, so I hope, yeah, this makes sense. Now, so we saw how we can iterate through each element of our string. What if you wanted to iterate through each word of the sentence and not each element? Okay, so let's say you have a sentence and you wanted to iterate over each word of the sentence and not each element. Okay, so we have an important method available with strings known as split method. Okay, so we have not discussed the split method in strings because we did not discuss list then, right? But now we can do that. Okay, so we can use the split method. So this method returns the list of words separated by the character we want to separate them by. So essentially what we're trying to do here, we'll take a string, okay, and we'll try to convert that string into a list of strings, okay. And the split method will need to define the character by which we'll try to uh, separate, yeah, separate out those words, okay. So it will become clear with this example. So this is a particular Heisenberg code which I have stored in a string. Okay, so this is the string. So I'll just read out the code because it's really nice. Right, so it ceases to exist without me. So no, you clearly don't know what who are you talking to. So let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger. Right. So this is a quote by Heisenberg. So let's run this. Okay. So now what we can do, so I'm creating a variable, so which I'm storing as words by Walter. So if you're not familiar, so in Breaking Bad, Walter White takes the name of Heisenberg, okay, because he was the chemistry teacher. Okay, enough about the pop culture. So I've created this variable words by Walter, and what I'm doing, so in this string, which is stored in Heisenberg quote, so I'm calling the split method, right? So you know how to call a method. So you write the string variable name, you write dot, and then you write split, and then I want to uh, separate or split the words which are separated by spaces here, right? So this is my separating character, the space. Okay, so let's see what happens. Okay, so I have all the words here which are separated by spaces. So eight, there is a space after it. So it is one element of this list. Okay, so split method gives you a list of strings. Okay, now here you have ceases, you have to, you have exist, you have without, we have me, right? So here you have me dot rather than me. Okay, because we are defining split by space only. So wherever it sees any space, it will extract an element there and store that in the list. Okay, so are you guys able to understand what this split method is trying to do? Okay, okay, so let's say we don't specify anything, so what will uh, we get here, right? So essentially uh, the default character is space only. Okay, so I just wanted to demonstrate you that every method which you'll encounter for any object, right? Because a split method makes sense for a string, right? So you need to understand if there is any such method of functionality available for a given data structure, you need to understand if what arguments it can have, right? So you need to think about those, then you will be able to understand what's going on. Okay. Okay. So that's great. So you guys are able to understand what's going on. Okay. So so let's say what I want to do, I want to only print those words uh, which are not I and U. Okay, so how can I do that? So I'll write for word in words by Walter. So this is our words by Walter. Okay. So in the for loop, I'll write a if statement. So if this word not in, so I'm not sure if you have encountered this particular thing. So there is one in, there is another not in. Okay, so you can check for a particular element if it exists in a group of elements, right? So that group could be your list, that group could be your tuple, it could be a dictionary as well. Okay, so if this word not in IU, okay, so we'll just print this. Okay, so let's go ahead and execute this. So as you can see, we don't have I here. Okay, so maybe I am not in danger, so here will not get I, right? So after in, it's just printing am. So I hope this makes sense, right? So what, so this will return you a boolean value. So if I am checking for word not in this particular list of strings, so if this word is not available there, so it will return false. Okay, so this essentially whatever I have highlighted here, this returns a boolean value. Okay, either true or false depending upon that word isn't there in that list or not. Okay, okay, all right. So of course we can iterate over elements of tuple, right, in a similar way. So I have this tuple which is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? So again you can write for day in days, and then you can write today is this. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this, right? So it's pretty much straightforward. So it's very similar to what we have in list. Okay, so tuples have a very special quality when it comes to for loops. Okay, so because they will be used a lot when we implement for loops in future classes. So if you're iterating through a sequence that contains tuples, the item can actually be the tuple itself, and this is an example of what we call as tuple unpacking. Okay, so I'll just try to go through an example and this will make sense to you. So just an additional remark. So during the for loop, we'll be unpacking the tuple inside of a sequence, and we can access the individual elements inside that tuple. Okay. So let's see what we got in the chat. Okay. All right. So you remember this country city list which we have from the earlier classes. So can you tell me what we call this particular object? Right. So this is called a list of tuples. Right. So it's a list of tuples, and the first element is the country, and the second element of each tuple is the corresponding city. Okay. So now let's iterate through each tuple element of this list and unpack each item. Okay. So what can we do? So we'll write for, then because we know that each element of our list has each element of our list is a tuple, right? And each tuple has two elements, right? One is country and the other is city for that element. So what we can do, we can write something like for, then we can have two iterators because there are two elements for each tuple element, right? So for country comma city, then of course the in keyword, and then of course your list of tuples. So now we can use the f string. So I can print the capital of the country. So now within the parenthesis curly braces, you can pass this variable country, and then you can pass the city here. Okay. So let's see how this works. Okay. Of course, this is not defined. So whenever you encounter any such error, you know that this has not been defined, and you need to have that particular variable name. Okay, or you might have misspelled your variable name. So let's see. Okay, so it goes through the first element in the first iteration. It takes the country to be India and the city to be New Delhi. Okay, then it prints the capital of the country India is New Delhi. Then it goes to the second element. Now in the second iteration, country will take the value Australia and the city will take the value Canberra. Okay, so you are able to, I hope, make sense how this tuple unpacking is working, right? So because we know that each element of our list, which is your country city list, each element of this list is a tuple with two elements. Okay, so we can extract all of them. So maybe if I can add another, so let's say this is not only country city list, this is, let's say, also river. I'm not sure if I remember the names of any river in Australia, but I'll try to do my best. Okay. So maybe if anyone knows any river in Australia, so maybe I'll just write something like Darwin River. And then in United States, uh, maybe. Okay, so Sanchita is, yeah. So rovers. Okay, so that's okay. And can anyone tell me any particular river name in United States? So okay, so Mississippi. Okay, that's, or maybe I can write a smaller one, Missouri. And then in England we have Thames. Okay, so that I know. Okay, so let's. So I have put extra. Okay. So this is our country, city, river list. But now, as you can see, each tuple element has now three elements, right? So each tuple element now has three elements. So what I can write here, so I can also write comma river, okay? So I can write the capital of the country is city, and it also has the river and the name of the river, okay? So let's see, and then I can add full stop, okay? So as you can see, so not enough values to unpack. So somewhere I wait a second. So of course I need to update my list variable name, right? So this is okay. Okay. So now as you can see, so now you should be able to understand how tuple unpacking is working, right? So here in each tuple, which is being encountered during each iteration, it has three elements. Okay. So that's why we need to provide three iterators, right? So let's say if I just provide country, city, okay, and let's say even if I skip this particular thing, what should happen, right? So it will throw an error. So this error is called value error. So too many values to unpack, right? So in your country, city, river list, each tuple element has three elements, but you're only saying country, city, right? So it's not able to identify which element you are talking about. Is it India, New Delhi, or is it New Delhi, Ganga? Something like that, right? So you can have river, and then yeah. So and then this will work like magic. Okay. So now I have not, of course, printed the name of the river, but you can do that too. That's totally up to you. All right. So let's execute this. Okay. So now we have seen how we can iterate over a list, how we can iterate over a tuple, how we can iterate over a list of tuples, which is essentially a list only. So we talked about tuple unpacking during each iteration, right? So I hope that makes sense. We need to equate the number of iterators to be equal to the number of elements present inside each of the tuple. If you are dealing with, let's say, a list of tuples. We can also iterate over a dictionary. So okay, so let's take an example of this. So of course we have this country, city, river list. So we'll not use that. We'll use the country, city list. Okay. So as you can see, this dictionary, the key is the name of the country, and the value for corresponding to this key is the city. Okay. So yeah. Now what we can do, we can write something like for item in country, city, dict. So if we write something similar to a list and print this item, so this will just print you the keys of your dictionary. Okay, it will not get you the values, but it will just print you the keys of the dictionary. Okay, so as I told you, this just prints the keys of the dictionary. So next we can iterate through the key value pairs using the items method. Okay, so I am not sure if you have uh, employed this item method. Okay, so dict dot items. So have you tried to run this before? Okay, so this is dict items, and if you can see, if I just write list here, okay, so this will be a list of tuples only. Okay, so this is essentially a list of tuples. Okay. Okay, so that's great. Uh, so we can now iterate. So here, when we just write it for item and in this dictionary, so it just printed the keys, right? It did not print the value. But let's say if I want to have a lot more flexibility, I want to iterate through the key value pair. Okay, so what you can write here. So for country, comma city. Okay, so in country city dict dot items. Okay, so this is again, so I didn't even, so I applied list here, but if you just see this, right, so this gives you something called dict items, and then you have this list of tuples. So this is again an iterator object. Okay, so we'll of course be applying for loop only on iterable object, right? So whatever we are getting out of this is exactly the same thing. So this is an iterable object, and each element of in this iterable object is a tuple. Okay, and we can unpack that tuple by just writing country comma city, right? So in the first iteration, country will be India and the city will be New Delhi. Okay, so let's go ahead and print this. Okay, so in this way you can iterate over the elements of the dictionary too. Okay, so you need to use this dot items. Okay, so dictionary object name dot items, and then the parenthesis, and of course, as you know, that this will give you a list of tuples. Okay, so I hope, yeah, that makes sense, everyone. So these are all the examples which we have discussed. We have not talked about, yeah, so we have tried to cover almost all the examples here, various kind of scenarios which are there. Okay, so there are some things which we can in fact try to do on your own. Okay, so maybe let's say if I want to iterate over a set. Okay, so is that you have not seen that? So let's say 1 comma 2 comma 3, and then I can print let's say this elf. What do you think will happen in this case? Right, so it prints the corresponding. So you can also iterate over the over a set. Okay, so that's totally fine. Okay, so can you guys, yeah, please, so a very simple question. I'll just try to ask you guys in here. So 8089. Okay, so can you guys tell me this particular question which is being asked by Smruti? So will enumerate work in sets? Do you think enumerate will work in sets? And so can you write the answer, that is your of course boolean, that is yes or no, and then can you write a small reason? So just add because, and yeah. So if you talk about an element in a set, what information do we have for that? Right, so we just have the value of that element, right? So there's no index, right? Set is not a sequence of elements, right? So this is really important. So I hope yeah, Samruddhi is able to, yeah, clarify his doubt. Okay, I'll just clear this. Yeah, I think, yeah, we took a lot of time in studying for loops, but of course, yeah, this is one of the most important concepts which you'll be using in Python programming. Okay, so later on when we discuss pandas and numpy, so you'll also be iterating over the rows of your data frames, right? So all those things will come in, but the same concepts will apply, right? So you need to understand, see, whenever you're using for loops, right? So tuples are really important, right? And that's why let's say if you when we study about functions in the Wednesday class, so we'll be returning a lot of tuples in our functions, and that's where the utility of tuples will come in, right? And you'll be able to appreciate why these are really important objects. Okay, so now moving from for loops to while loops. Okay, so I don't think I'll be able to discuss a lot of things, but let's try to wrap up the session within 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have the quiz. Okay, so the while statement in Python is one of the most general ways to perform iteration. Okay, in fact, yeah, I'll just be linguistically consistent. So one of the most, of course. Okay, so a while statement will repeatedly execute a single statement or group of statements as long as the condition is true. Okay, so whatever thing you have mentioned within the while statement, if the condition in while statement is true, it will execute it as long as the condition is true. Okay, so the reason it is called a loop is because the code statements are looped through over and over again until the condition is no longer met. Okay, so this is the format of a while loop, right? So you write while keyword, then you write a condition essentially which will return a boolean, then of course the colon, and then you write some bunch of actions which you want to do, of course you need to keep in mind that you will have proper indentation. Okay, and then whatever, let's say if you want to pass everything else, if the condition is not fulfilled, so pass them to else, right? So you can do that. So let's take an example of this. Okay, so I'll just clear the output here. So now I have a variable x in which initially I've assigned the value 0. Okay, so now I'm trying to run a while loop. Okay, so what I'm writing, while x less than 10. Okay, so while x less than 10. So what? So this will always return a boolean value, right? True or false. So if x is less than 10, and if indeed it is 10, so it will return true. But if it's greater than 10, it will return false, right? So as long as this particular thing which I've highlighted here, this yields the value or the boolean value true, then only whatever we have written in the within the while statement will be executed. Okay, so very simple way to write a while loop. So you write the while keyword, you write your condition, okay, then you write colon, and then of course you press enter, you will be taken to the automated indentation. Okay, so which I've already written it here. So you write, if this condition is true, I'll print x is currently this, print x is still less than 10, adding 1 to x. Then in x you will add x plus 1, right? So you'll keep incrementing x during the iteration. Okay, and then you will print x. Okay, so let's see. Okay. So I'll skip the last print statement, try to just execute this one. Okay, so in the first, because x is initially taking the value 0, so x is currently 0, then it will print x is still less than 10, adding 1 to x. Now it will add 1 to x, so that means the new updated value of x is 1, as in 0 plus 1, that is 1. So now, so this is what we are getting from the first iteration. Now it moves to the next iteration. So what will happen, because x has now been updated to 1, so it will print x is currently 1, then it will print this particular statement right here. So till here, so this is what we are getting in the second iteration. Now similarly we'll be getting this in the third iteration, and right in the fourth iteration we'll be getting this particular thing, right? And now finally what will happen, that once we have gone through the 10 iterations, x will be something like 9 plus 1, that means 10, right? So now because x is 10 and you are writing 10 less than 10, right? So that will yield false. So that means whatever that is within the while loop will not get executed, and we are out of the loop now, right? So this loop will not execute. Okay, so because this condition was not satisfied, and it breaks the loop essentially. Okay, so I hope, yeah, this makes sense. Yeah, can you guys please confirm if the while loop is clear, at least whatever I have discussed till now? Okay, that's great. Yeah, okay. So as you can notice, how many times the print statement occurred, and why, and how the while loop kept going until the true condition was met, which, right, so until the false condition was met, right? This should be false. Okay, so it kept going until the false condition was met, which occurred when x was equal to 10, right? So important to note that once this occurred, the code stopped, right? So let's see how we can add an else statement here in the same piece of code. So of course I don't want to print this over 10 times, so I'll just keep this to 5. Okay, so while x less than 5, do something. Now whatever, let's say if it's outside that, so what we can do, else print this, right? So else print. So you know this /n, so this will add a new line. Okay, so I hope you are aware of this particular thing. /n will introduce a new line. Okay, and then you can print all done, and then finally you can simply print I am done with the iterations, right? So this will be executed regardless of whatever there is, unless you have run an infinite while loop, right? So there's one important difference between while and for loop. So for loop is the number of iterations is fixed or definite, right? But in the case of while loop, the number of iterations are not defined. It will execute as long as the condition is true, right? So it's an example of indefinite loop, right? But for loop is an example of definite loop, as in we know how many times the for loop is going to run, but we don't know how many times a while loop is going to run. Of course, we can verify them manually, right? But let's say while loop will run as long as the condition is true. So it is also called as indefinite loop. Okay. Okay. So Prashant is asking, what is the point of putting else there, since the statements inside it will be executed even without it? Uh, Sorry. Okay. So what is the point of putting else? Okay. Since the statement outside inside it, it will be
Uh,
executed. Yeah, Prashant. Yeah,
yeah,
please.
because I was actually asking that even if we don't use else and directly without intending write print
Right. So you can
new line
simply,
and print
yeah,
all
just
done, it
print
will
this too,
execute
right?
in the same way.
Right, right. So you're saying that, yeah, if you just write this print,
Yeah,
so
so
something we can
that's
do, so we can, yeah, we can avoid that, right? But it will come handy, not in this case. So let's say if you're using a while loop inside another while loop, right? So when you have nested loop structure, so there that might come in handy because you want to handle your the counter case, right? Okay. So of course you can do this without this too, but the else thing will become handy when you write, let's say, nested loop structure. So maybe within a for loop you can try writing a while loop, okay, depending upon what's the use case you are trying to work at. So that those things you can have, right? So let's say within a for loop you write a while loop, and then you need to somehow take care of the other cases, right? So there you will write the, let's say, else part, okay? Or maybe you can simply write whatever you want to execute, so you can write simple statements, right, within the else part. Okay, so means that's required or that's not even required, it's up to you. Okay, but yeah, so I think if you look from uh, the perspective of a structure, okay, so that else part adds a structure in a way, okay, at least in the in terms of aesthetics, right? So whatever that was not in fulfilled in the while condition, right, so that is now being taken care in the else part. Okay, so from the point of view of aesthetics it looks good, because of course outside the else you can execute whatever you want to, right? But from the point of view of aesthetics it looks better. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, great. So we have a bunch of keywords like break, continue, and pass. Okay. So so break basically breaks out of the current closes and closing loop. Continue goes to the top of the closes and closing loop. Pass, it does nothing at all. Okay. So we can have something like uh, guys, can you please mute yourself? We are running out of time, and I, yeah, just need to cover this before we go ahead with the quiz. Okay, so while test, so this is your condition. uh, okay, so while, then of course you write something, and let's say you have let's say written a if statement within it. So if some condition, then you can call break, right? So what break does, it breaks out of the current closest and closing loop, right? So what is the current closest and closing loop? This is the while in this case. Okay, so let's take few example. Okay, and maybe we can break it. Okay, if let's say I can add a break statement here. Okay, so let's try to run this. Okay, so what happens here, so x was initially 0. Okay, I'm incrementing this for each iteration. So right, as you can see here, everything here within the while, you can see the indentation is perfect for all the statements within while loop. So all the statements here are within the while loop only. Okay, so you can so print firstly what you will print x is currently 0, x is still less than 10. Adding 1 to x, you will add 1 to x. I'm not sure. Yeah, Said, yeah, please. Okay. Okay, so now what happens? So your x is 0, it gets 1 gets added to it, so now x becomes 1. It goes to the another iteration, right? Because this will not be satisfied. Yeah, so this is not satisfied in the first iteration, right? Because x is not equal to 0, x is not equal to 1, right? Because here x in the first iteration x is getting updated to 1. This part will not be executed because this condition is false. Okay, it goes to the else part. It says print continuing, and then it basically we have this keyword continue. Okay, so it continues, right? So the iteration continues. Okay, and then in the second iteration x is currently 1, x is less than this, then it prints the same thing. Now it what happens in after the second third iteration, right? So when x is actually equal to 3, okay, so when x is actually equal to 3, so this if condition will be satisfied. That means whatever it is written within the if block will be executed. So we'll be printing x is equal to 3. This is what I have printed, and then we have this keyword break. That means it breaks out of the loop. Okay, essentially if you have some nested loop, okay, let's talk about it later, but for now just think about this. So when we write the break keyword, it breaks out of the current closes and closing loop. Okay, so it says that I don't want to do anything at all, I'll take some rest. Okay, because you have told me that take a break, so I'll not do anything else. Okay, so it stops executing. Okay, so current what it does goes to the top of the closes and closing loop. Okay, so here when I wrote continue, that means it went to the top of this loop. Okay, so then it moved, yeah, the iteration happened. Okay, it would be interesting to see if I don't have this continue here. So this will again print the same thing, right? So of course whatever that is written within the while block, if everything is executed, so it will of course go to the next iteration. Okay, now it will check that if that condition is being satisfied. Okay, so let's say if I do not write, if I comment this out, okay, so what do you think will happen in this case? Wait a bit, just wait a bit. I'll just give you some time to answer here. Maybe, yeah. Of course, this is a single post, so I can use my discretion. Okay, so let's say if I comment this particular piece of line, so what will happen? Can you tell me? Infinite loop, right? So while loop is an example of indefinite loop, right? So as long as this condition which is written against the while keyword, if that is true, it will execute whatever the statement is are written within the while block. Okay, so I hope, yeah, you get this particular idea. And then of course you can play around with these keywords break, continue, and then you can have pass. So pass essentially does not do anything at all, right? So yeah, so this is it, what I wanted to discuss in for loop and while loop, right? So for loop is relatively straightforward to use, but okay, so pass does not do anything, but it's useful to have that. So let's say for example, let's run this particular piece of code. Okay, so in this case, yeah, so it does not do anything at all. Okay, so it says that, yeah, this will be important. So pass keyword you can choose to use or not. Okay, depending upon your appetite. Okay, so you can choose to use the pass keyword when you want to avoid some sort of confusion, but it essentially does not do much. Okay. Right, so Himanshu is correct, right? So if we want to have empty loop, we can use it. Okay, so something like that. Okay, so continue, what it will do, continue will take you to the closest enclosing loop. Okay, so the closest enclosing loop. Okay, so in this case we saw an example, right? So here I had written continue. Okay, and these things will be used more often when we are writing some nested list structure, nested loop structure, in fact, right? So something like while, let's say, x less than 10, and then here you can also write something like while x uh, greater than 3, right? Something like this, and then here you would want to use pass keyword, or maybe else you'd want to write continue, something like this, etc., etc. You can have bunch of various things, right? And all these things, so you'll be tested on these particular things in your assignment. Okay, so I hope most of the definitions are clear here, right? So what continue does, what pass does, they will be useful when you write some nested structure, right? So we can have the for loop within a while loop. So let's say for element, let's say my list of numbers. Okay, so my list of numbers, and then you can check whether lm is greater than 10, and you can try doing a lot of operations what you want to do. Okay, right? So essentially when you write continue, okay, so what I told you, it goes to the top of the current enclosing loop, right? So as soon as it encounters this continue keyword, it goes to the top of the loop, right? So it will not do anything uh, below it, right? So continue means you just go to the top of the loop. Okay, so I hope, yeah, that's clear. Okay, most of the cases you would not be using pass continue, but I think, yeah, that depends upon this scenario and the use case too, right? So mostly you will be using break, or of course you can use the continue, right? If you are trying to write a code for a particular use case, right?